So first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Hurst for keeping this impressive project going for so many years, I think since 2008. Yeah, and thank you for having me here. My name is Daniel Serravalle de Sá. I work at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Florianópolis, Brazil. Today to talk about Brazilian Gothic, a term that contains a potential contradiction, which is the combination of the opposing ideas of solar and gloom in one concept. However, as it turns out, there are several motives that can juxtapose these apparently conflicting ideas. This Gothic reading of Brazilian texts contain elements that are partially familiar and partially unfamiliar, partially resembling well-known Gothic features from Anglo-American culture, and yet evoking something quite unrecognizable outside the Brazilian frame of reference. The different meanings that such Gothic elements gain in the tropical context are often linked to images of violent encounters, and I'm thinking here of colonization, slavery, dictatorship, and also images of hybridity, cultural, racial, and religious. These are all landscapes of fear which the artists want either to reinforce or to suppress. Therefore, these Gothic landscapes imply the iteration of trauma, which affect the environs, the bodies, and the psyches of Brazilian people, frequently in encrypted ways, evidencing the underbelly of a Brazilian national culture. So caught somewhere between reconciliation and difference, to interpret Brazilian texts in the light of the Gothic means to address the construction of meaning in the history of Brazil, since the Gothic has a potential to reanimate old traumas and provoke discussions about national culture within particular social landscapes. As a first example of this, I'd like to comment the image that Dr. Hurst chose for the Eventbrite website. I hope you can see it. Yeah, okay. Right, so this shows in the foreground a woman walking in an impoverished part of town. You have all that yellow and orange hues, and there is a modern city in the background. And you can see the skyscrapers, what Frederick Jameson calls a city of the late capitalism in his book about the postmodern. And I know the city, São Paulo, because it's built on this huge plateau, and the more destitute areas are built around it. So the geographical layout makes it easy to seclude people. It works like a citadel, like a fortress, right? In Rio de Janeiro, there is a different landscape, kind of a reverse topography. The favelas are on top of the mountains and hills, looking down, literally, but also holding in contempt the wealthy parts of town that are built on sea level. These landscapes, they impact on people's collective and individual psychodynamics as they contribute to foreground issues linked to cultural, sexual, and racial otherness, class struggle, and other potentially Gothic scenarios, because they place the subject at the edge of symbolic dissolution. So the existence of what I call Brazilian Gothic is an inchoate field. It cannot be conceptualized as a tradition, but as a composite of intervention by different writers, filmmakers, and artists at different periods. It yields neither a genre nor a tradition, but rather a multivalent tendencies, and it coheres, if at all, around matters such as the dismantling of a metonymic national subject. There are 3 points that I need to explain before I explore how the particular circumstances of Brazil's history and cultural institutions generate a series of inflections that determine a type of Gothic that both borrows and differs, considerably from Anglo-American versions, right? So these 3 points are, firstly, the Brazilian folkloric oral heritage, then the literary or written tradition that we receive from Europe, and then the critical theory developed by Brazilian scholars, right? So I'll start with the folkloric landscape. Like every nation in the world, Brazil has its own traditions of folk tales and mysterious legends and religious superstitions, mystical ballads. You see, these popular expressions, they are the unique product of the different cultures that formed the country. With the passing of time, a network of exchanges was established between the mythology of the indigenous people, the African heritage, and the European cultural matrix, forming a collective imaginary that disseminated among Brazilians in the form of oral tales, told at night on lamp-lit verandas or around a bonfire under the light of the moon. In Antologia do Folclore Brasileiro, or Anthology of Brazilian Folklore, first published in 1944, and still one of the finest historical surveys of the kind in Portuguese language, Câmara Cascudo registers numerous folkloric references to mysteries involving life and death, the battle between good and evil, and the interference of the supernatural in the natural world. Right, let me show you one example here. Right, so the boiuna is a gigantic snake that roams in the many uncharted rivers of the Amazon forest. It's linked to the creation of the world, and it can change the course of waters that curve through the jungle, just like a snake. The river is home to all sorts of supernatural occurrences, and boiuna is this hostile force that can capsize boats and change the shape of the river, trapping people in the jungle. You see, these oral legends about rivers and water bodies like seas and lakes, they found a way into Brazilian literature. And I'm thinking here about water-related fatalities in the novel O Filho do Pescador, The Fisherman's Son, by Antônio Gonçalves Teixeira. And the chasm, right, the gorge in Tronco do Ipê, and also the cove, which is like a sea inlet in the poem A Nebulosa by Joaquim Manuel de Macedo. So from the oral tradition into literature. Let's see what's next. All right, so this is the Saci. This legend can be traced back to an indigenous Tupi-Guarani entity called Yaci Yatere, who is a magical one-legged child. But it fully became the Saci we know only in the 18th century, when the legend was appropriated by African Brazilians, and the Saci was transformed into a black entity who smokes a clay and reed pipe and wears this red Phrygian cap, right? The Liberty cap, some people call it. Although he has only one leg, the Saci is extremely agile, so much so that his one leg is sometimes represented by a whirlwind, one of those dust devils, right? He rejoices in small mischievous acts, but only to annoy humans. So he hides domestic objects, he sets farm animals loose, he makes food burn on the stove. He's a trickster, he's a prankster, right? Here's another one. Curupira. Although there are many regional variations in the description of the Curupira, the most popular version is an entity with bright red, flame-colored hair, sometimes fire for hair, and his feet are turned to face backwards, right? So his back-to-front feet create footprints that make hunters and travelers confused, often leading them back to the starting point. The Curupira lives in the forest and he preys on poachers and illegal hunters. He'll also protect females and animals who are taking care of their offspring. And according to the legend, the Curupira is unpredictable and he can occasionally seem wicked, but he does so to protect the fauna and the flora from predatory hunting, fishing, and too much resource extraction made by men, right? So there are many other examples and entities, including witches and devils, but I'll leave this here to make my point, right? So in spite of Brazil's folkloric heritage, the country never fully developed a Gothic horror as a national genre. So why does a nation with such a vibrant folkloric heritage in which mystery, imagination, and supernatural horror play such an important role not have a more distinguishing tradition of Gothic fiction, right? Why do most renowned Brazilian writers and artists create narratives that favor descriptions of the realities of life and not the figments of the imagination? Well, there are many ways to answer this question, and in part, it can be explained by judgments about the theme of supernatural horror, which in Brazil is often associated with archaic and rural manifestations. Because Brazil was a Portuguese colony for about 300 years, the texts that are considered exponents, advocates of Brazilian culture, consist of works that tend to emphasize social political issues and to promote a more cosmopolitan, urban, cultural life, right? Therefore, these judgments, they created bias against supernatural Gothic horror narratives, which became associated with backwardness and uncivilized folkloric and agricultural expressions. And this influenced how literature, how fiction was studied and even produced in the country. So at least in part, right, the absence of a more distinguishing Gothic horror tradition is related to this colonial trauma that forces us to question the tenets of the country's history and institutions. So I have been talking about Brazilian folkloric tradition and oral law, but there is another landscape, another scenario that needs to be taken in consideration to understand the singularities of Brazilian Gothic. And in this sense, I must say a few words about the country's written literary tradition and the presence of Gothic novels in Brazil. All right. So you see, during the colonial period, Brazil was virtually uncharted territory as far as print and reading culture were concerned. All literary material was subject to governmental censorship. There was a reduced numbers of booksellers in the country, and the lack of a local press in universities were structural predicaments that hindered the circulation of printed material. It was only in 1808 when Napoleon marched over Lisbon and Rio de Janeiro unexpectedly became the capital of the Portuguese Empire, that the circulation of books and other printed material intensified as a result of a treaty opening Brazilian ports to trade with foreign nations, which at the time meant mostly Britain. You see, in 1808, Napoleon proclaimed a commercial blockade against England, but Portugal and England were solid partners in their respective colonial enterprises. So to avoid confrontation with Napoleon, the Prince Regent, Dom João, escaped to his American colony with the help of Britain's diplomatic envoy, Lord Strangford, and the Royal Navy. Now, from the Brazilian point of view, right, this was a watershed moment as it inverted the center-periphery dynamics, the empire and the colony. Who is the empire? Who is the colony now? The King of Portugal was now in Brazil, ruling an European country from Rio de Janeiro. And this was rather unique, right? You're not going to find the situation in the history of any other country in the Americas. So the arrival of the Portuguese royal court brought significant structural and cultural developments that helped to change the scenario, the landscape of isolation, cultural isolation that had prevailed throughout colonial times. Brazil was by large lagging behind other South American countries, such as Peru, whose first university was chartered in 1551. And also Mexico and Argentina, who had royal permission to develop a local print culture since the 1770s. And that's a sign of two distinct approaches to colonization in the Portuguese and in Spanish America. So there was an influx of different industrialized products in Brazil, right? Chinaware, glass, pots and pans, cutlery, building tools, and more to the point, a wide range of books, periodicals, and novels. At the time, about 2 centuries of fiction was made available in tandem for Brazilian readers and aspiring writers alike. Hence, Roberto Schwartz's statement that the novel had existed in Brazil before there were any Brazilian novelists. Now, different people will say different things, but I agree with Schwartz that the novel genre emerged in Brazil only in the 1820s. And this is because freedom of press only happened in 1821. Only then, the flourishing Brazilian novel became an important vehicle for debates about national identity and amidst political deliberations about republicanism and federalism, uprisings in the provinces, and great social unrest in the cities. But you see, however, it was not until the 1990s, there was much evidence as to the existence of British novels arriving in Brazil. Therefore, it was not unusual for Brazilian historians and critics and cultural commentators to deem irrelevant their impact on local writers, and let alone the impact of British Gothic novels, right? It took important studies and projects such as Caminhos do Romance, or The Ways of the Novel, to demonstrate that a considerable number of novels that circulated in Rio in the 19th century were in fact British, right? And departing from this broader research, I highlight that many of those novels were Gothic novels, right? So the material, the physical presence of British Gothic novels in Brazil can be proved by catalog entries and book listings from institutions such as Gesellschaft Germania, founded in 1821, and the Rio de Janeiro British Subscription Library, founded in 1826, Real Gabinete Português de Leitura, founded in 1837, and Biblioteca Fluminense, founded in 1847. And these places, they served as sites for reading and borrowing books throughout the 19th century. You see, such records, they're quite remarkable, not so much in terms of numbers, right? Given that the reading public was small, but rather in terms of the array of titles and novelists on offer. Not to mention the potential existence of Gothic fiction in the form of blue books, journals, magazines, and abridgment of full-length novels that have since disappeared without a trace. We only have the entries, right? For the most part, we don't have the novels anymore. So what I'm saying here is that we have this historical material evidence of the circulation of Gothic novels in Brazil in the form of entries in Rio de Janeiro's libraries and catalogs. For example, O Castelo de Otranto, Conto Gótico, printed in Lisbon, right? This is, of course, the Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, but actually in the Rio de Janeiro library, it's incorrectly attributed to some William Marshall, right? So we don't know what happened there. There is Anne Radcliffe, Adelina e Teodoro, or Abadia de St. Clair. This is Anne Radcliffe's The Romance of the Forest. The Portuguese version is based on a French translation, La Forêt or La Baie de St. Clair. O Italiano, ou O Confessionário dos Penitentes Negros. This is the Italian, right? The Confessional of the Black Penitents. Júlia, ou Subterrâneos do Castelo de Mazzini. This is the translation of Radcliffe's A Sicilian Romance. Os Mistérios do Castelo de Udolpho. This is, of course, the Mysteries of Udolpho. There is Sophia Lee, right? O Subterrâneo, or Matilda, Portuguese translation. This is the translation of the novel The Recess. There's William Beckford, Vadek Comte Arabi. This one is actually in French. It was often a three-legged journey, right? From England to France, France, Portugal, Portugal, Brazil, right? You see, although there was a war, business never stops. There is also Matthew Lewis, O Monge, that's the monk. O Salteador de Veneza. This is the Bravo of Venice, and itself, it's a translation from the German. It's Schocker. Lewis, he spoke German as a child, and he translated Schocker's novel into English, right? The Bravo of Venice. Regina Maria Rocher, Oscar, Amanda e Oscar, ou A História da Família Dunrith. This is The Children of the Abbey, right? So these Gothic catalog entries, they are part of a larger body of British literature that was circulating in Brazil in the 19th century. Well, now the question, right, that begs to be answered. Could these cultural items made available for the Brazilian reading public, however small, have served as model for aspiring writers? In other words, could these Gothic narratives have contributed to the process of formation of the Brazilian novel? I'm arguing here that these literary forms and images from Gothic novels might have played a more important role in the consolidation of the Brazilian novel than previously believed, right? So, in other words, Gothic novels may have provided models for the forerunners of Brazilian literature who borrowed their narrative strategies and the repertoire of mystery and melodrama and terror, adapting the Gothic images linked to the representation of villainy and discourses of demonization to show the underbelly of Brazil's largely optimistic surface. So as well as the oral law, this hybrid literary tradition is another scenario that needs to be taken in consideration to understand the singularities of Brazilian Gothic. This reworking of situations and scenes and stereotypes is known in Brazil as cultural cannibalism, and it's a metaphor for the ingestion and the assimilation of foreign culture in Brazilian terms, right? It's strongly related to parodic forms, and since São Paulo's modern art week that took place in 1922, it has been a cultural constant and a driving force in the country's national culture. Although these transpositions, these hybridizations and acclimatizations, they're tributary of foreign cultural items, they also reveal something quite peculiar about the circumstances of Brazil's social history and social discourses. So cannibalism is taken here as a cultural strategy. And in this sense, the cannibal mind would be at work in Brazil to this day, occupying a central role in the national unconscious, which is prone to masticating and digesting the foreign other. But rather than an act of violence, it's a demonstration of respect for the outsider, capturing, dismembering, and devouring their bodies in order to absorb its or their virtues, right? There is a famous sentence, to be or not to be, that is the question. This was famously spoken at a banquet during the Modern Art Week, and it summarizes the dilemma of national identity, a parodic version of a famous quotation by William Shakespeare, invoking the once largest indigenous group to live in the territory that we now call Brazil. This is Brazilian self-deprecating humor that highlights the country's peripheral position, transforming that peripheral condition into a source of self-irony. So redeemed by laughter, cultural cannibalism is a mode of interpretation that contains the cognitive function of enhancing Brazil's national consciousness in a singular manner. So when it comes to Gothic horror, this should not be considered a debasement of the genuine or original Gothic narratives, since the comic is intrinsic to the Gothic, since at least Walpole's Castle of Otranto. Avril Horner and Sue Slosnick, they state, and I quote here, the comic Gothic turn is the Gothic's own doppelganger. And they argue that the surface element of Gothic fiction allows for an easy dialectic between the rational and the irrational, emotion and intellect, artificiality and authenticity, and above all, horror and laughter, right? So my point here is that in the Brazilian cultural dimension, this comic Gothic does not just function as relief, comic relief. It's also capable of social comment about Brazilian history and identity. So I'm talking here about bitter laughter, right? So that leads us to a third landscape, which is necessary to frame the idea of a Brazilian Gothic, which is the critical theory developed by Brazilian scholars. So the oral law, the written tradition, and now the critical theory. You see, Brazilian intellectuals, they have been especially aware about this long-standing history of cultural colonization, and they endeavored to redress this by providing the country with a set of key names and themes and texts worthy of artistic and cultural appraisal, right? When you look at Brazilian criticism, they are very tight. They do disagree on small things, but they agree on what's important. It's a 200-year project, and they're interested in literature and society, right? So this ideological construction of Brazil's literary and artistic history, it resulted in fruitful theoretical debates and aesthetic debates. There's no doubt about that. But it also restricted the scope of investigation, and it professed a kind of a isolationist vision of Brazilian culture, one that ignored historical appropriations from international sources, and especially in relation to popular Gothic horror sources. So what I'm saying here is that the absence of a distinguishing Brazilian Gothic production is also partially related to an institutional discourse, to an intellectual project that emerged already in the second half of the 19th century. And I'm thinking here, Silvio Romero, Araripe Jr., José Veríssimo, and this influential generation of critics linked to the upper middle class and in dialogue with a cultural elite was followed in the 20th century by an equally influential generation of scholars. And I'm thinking here Afrânio Coutinho, Brito Broca, Antônio Cândido, Alfredo Bossi, and together they established a literary historiography that relegated narratives of supernatural fear and Gothic imagination to the condition of sub-literature. So much so that it has become almost a commonplace to claim that horror narratives are rare in Brazil. Now, my point is that it's not that Brazilian literature is or has been little prone to abstractions. It's a question of critical perspective, right? In other words, the absence of a more distinguishing Brazilian Gothic tradition is rather a matter of how the national canon was organized and not really a lack of production. In fact, I argue here that issues such as colonization, slavery, dictatorship make Brazil a fertile field for the creation of narratives related to violence and fear. It's often the case that Gothic representations are connected to more social political violence and less to supernatural occurrences. But we do have many supernatural tales, and these Brazilian supernatural narratives usually offer a kind of a displacement of ideas as a way of spelling out concerns that could not be readily approached or otherwise could be more effectively discussed if transported into a world of horror and fantasy. So I'm talking allegory here, right? It's only in the last 20 years or so that groups of researchers linked to the study of Gothic fantasy began working to fill in this gap in the historiography of Brazilian literature. These contemporary studies, for the most part, are no longer centered on the idea of originality, but on how to organize and on how to discuss existing works, right? Seeking to rescue texts that were neglected by the main criticism. And by adopting this procedure, it must be recognized that Brazilian Gothic manifests itself both in prose and in verse, in canonical and in non-canonical texts. It's often the case that will not appear as a genre, but as a punctual comment, as a fragmented idea in a scene or perhaps a literary image. Everything is very fragmented, right? So instead of looking for a cohesive, clear-cut literary genre, the idea here is to admit that the study of Gothic in Brazilian culture should focus on discourse and on linguistic procedures. Also, it may appear as an iteration of a specific Anglo-American aesthetics or iconography, sometimes badly understood by us. We don't really get all the references, right? So much so that in this process of acclimatization, it's often something new is produced because we don't understand the reference. We just see the image and try to make sense of it. And also, Brazilian Gothic, it may be comical at times, but none of this invalidates its originality and potential for social comment. Okay, so it's not just a matter of recasting these old texts as Gothic now, right? But to work reflexively on the Gothic images that emerge in the texts and consider what it represents and also where those representations originate. So that's the work, right, that we're doing now. Let me give you an example now. All right, let's see how all this comes together, right? Oral law, written tradition, and critical theory. In the short story, A Dança dos Ossos, or the Dance of the Bones, or the Skeletal Dance, if you want, written in 1871 by Bernardo Guimarães, we have a nameless protagonist, a man from the city, who travels to the backlands of Brazil on business, and his guide there is the boatman Cirino, a caboclo, right? Meaning a man, and here it comes, of the semi-savage and nomadic race of dubious origin between the indigenous and the African, who wanders through the endless forests that run along the Parnaíba River, and whose names certainly are not inscribed in the parishes and do not even appear in the statistics of an empire of I don't know how many million inhabitants. Right, so there are a few things to be said here. The first is about Cirino being a man of mixed ancestry, right? He's black and indigenous and perhaps white as well. Basically, he's a Brazilian, right? The second is that he's sort of a creature of the wild, if you want, okay? He doesn't go to church and he's not registered in the population surveys. So he doesn't exist really, not officially. And the third is that the Portuguese Empire as a political unit that has authority over the territory and over the peoples has no control of what's happening in the backlands outside the major cities. Now, Cirino, he tells the protagonist this incredible story. It's kind of a local legend about how he saw once these sets of bones regroup into a skeleton, and then it danced and took him up in the air, him and his horse up in the air. You see, the story is beautifully narrated in the Todorovian fashion of the marvelous, right? That tradition in which the supernatural is accepted as supernatural. But you see, the protagonist, with his urban logic, he belittles the extraordinary narrative of the caboclo as a product of his excessively credulous belief in supernatural beings, or perhaps one too many sips, right? Then the protagonist, the man from the city, he presents a counter narrative in which he argues to have seen once two black men carrying a corpse in a hammock, and they were moving uncannily ahead of him and his horse. Something extraordinary, but it all turned out to be a spotted cow. It was an optical illusion, a glitch in the rationality. What Victor Sage calls coda dell'occhio, or the side of your eye, right? The tail of your eye, a delusion or a momentary misperception. That's in his book, The Empire and the Gothic. That's actually in an article in the book, The Empire and the Gothic. The caboclo, he asks at some point if the protagonist was afraid that the dead man would get off the hammock and take him up in the air. To which he replies, what I feared was that those black people would end me right there, and instead of one, carry two dead bodies into the same grave in the same hammock. So we saw two fantastic narratives, but the Gothic part is actually the second one, right? He's afraid of the black people. He's afraid the black people would kill him. So Guimarães' short story is an example of how Brazilian Gothic manifests itself as a cultural and racial rejection of the Brazilian countryside, which is seen as backward and primitive. It's populated by brown, superstitious people whose legends goes against the ideals of order and progress desired for the nation. So Brazilian Gothic is prolific in supernatural elements, right? We saw sacis and giant snakes and curupiras. However, the monstrous, the Gothic dehumanization emerges with greater force in the form of social and racial violence used to found the country. Let me show you, this is a painting by Jean-Baptiste Debray, He was a French painter who lived in Brazil for many years, and he produced many valuable lithographs depicting of the people of Brazil, right? He illustrated many significant moments in the history of Brazil, coronation, which are all extremely important for the knowledge of the 19th century, because they were made when the events portrayed were in progress, and it provides a source for the interpretation of Brazil in a period that is devoid of visual references. So this is what the protagonist thinks he sees in his Gothic moment of misperception, right, in his delusion. But instead of a planter being transported in the hammock, he sees a body. And it turns out to be a spotted cow, right? So this painting precedes the short story by about 60 years, right? And I bring it here just as an illustration. And also because it kind of refers to a Radcliffean tradition of the supernatural explained. That's what he does, right? So it wasn't two black people and a corpse in a hammock. After all, it was just a spotted cow. So he demystifies it. So my point here is that in this pursuit of a Brazilian Gothic tradition, right, or a Brazilian Gothic, there are numerous situations that highlight our dilemmas, national prejudices, and national traumas. And one way it manifests itself is in the descriptions of indigenous Black and mestizos bodies, producing hatred in relation to ethnic, cultural differences, even when they seem to be praising. So in Brazilian Gothic, the elements that symbolize the primitive, the savage nation, are purged by means of a Gothic horror discourse, which is often based on images of colonial and racial violence, images of violence and fear. Right, I have another example here for you. It's kind of a similar situation, right? It has a little bit of the oral folklore and a man from the city. So this is A Feiticeira, or The Witch, by Inglês de Souza. And in that story, a military man from the city decides to confront Maria Mucuim, who is kind of a local witch. She is described as having a copper face and a black mouth, which when opened in a horrible smile, it lets you see a tooth, just one, long and dark. So this military man, he tries to kill her, but later in the story, there is a flash river flood that puts him at her mercy. And she's in complete communion with nature and landscape. She becomes the power of the river itself. So in the light of this, the doubt between the natural or supernatural cause for the flash flood, it becomes obliterated in Gothic fashion by a discourse about hygiene that promotes racism. You see, the sorceress, Maria Mucuim, she's Gothicized, not because she might control nature, but because she encompasses biological and social characteristics related to skin color, gender, and also tooth decay. Now, I'm going to pursue, right, this line of thought, and I'm going to jump cut now from 19th century literature to 20th century film to show how these practices of Gothicizing the racial order reverberates throughout Brazilian history. And in this sense, the Gothic is a counter discourse to our official history, which has the capacity to expose our traumas from past and present, right? So, okay, I'm going to talk about the film O Anjo da Noite. or Night Angel by Walter Hugo Cury. In this film, there is a young woman. She's a psychology student. Her name is Anna. She's hired as a nanny for two children whose family lives in an isolated mansion in Petrópolis, which is a mountain town in the state of Rio de Janeiro. She's left alone for the weekend with the boy, the girl, and the night god. And soon she starts receiving these mysterious and threatening phone calls, and she panics. And this is complicated by the fact that the boy is infatuated with the nanny. And Anna, she does not mean to be seductive, right? Her position is friendly. She demonstrates awareness of the suffocating bourgeois sphere in which the children live. And they're needy children, right? They need affection. However, when the boy refuses to sleep, her mental state deteriorates and she witnesses him making one of the threatening calls. So the boy is making the threatening calls. So in a scene that foreshadows the tragedy that's about to happen, Anna stands next to a human-sized statue of an angel whose raised sword seems ready to be brought down on her. In another scene, she lies in the middle of the main hall, anticipating her death. The hall has this beautiful wooden ceiling, which at this point resembles kind of a coffin lid. All these images of death suggest that Anna is a foreign body in that mansion, and she senses the conflicts upon which the building is founded, right? You can take this allegorically, you see the house as a nation, right? But it's really the night god who represents the film's central ambiguity and national Gothic features. You see, at first, the watchman, he's presented as a servile man whose life is deeply attached to the location and to the family. Throughout the night, he becomes increasingly bold and scary. And in a scene that suggests the madness of the environment, the boy and the god, they start playing Bang Bang You're Dead inside the house. The boy uses his toy gun and the watchman his real gun. This very disturbing sequence culminates in an outbreak of violence when, in a fit of rage, the night god kills everyone. This ending, it might seem like a typical horror film finale, right? But the watchman is played by Eliezer Gomes, a Black actor, and that makes the whole difference, right? As a result, the night angel has this metaphoric and metonymic overtones, reflecting the issue of class conflict and social ethnic stratification in Brazilian society. So Cury's film shows awareness of the possibilities that would strike fear in a bourgeois audience in relation to their domestic workers. So casting Gomes for the role of the assassin is a choice that ultimately defies long-established postulations regarding Brazil's conciliatory nation and tropical paradise, and which allegedly has been shortening social ethnic distances between master and slaves since colonial times. That's just the discourse. And yet, in this Gothic film, fear is generated from or by the racial order, right? The social order, replacing the ghost or the monster as the source of anxiety. The night god develops a gradual but unconscious, perhaps, perception of the mediocrity that he's doomed to live, to watch, right? The indifference of the Brazilian bourgeoisie to the angst of those living in the margins of society, it erupts in this conclusion as a horrifying and threatening Gothic manifestation, right? There is one more film I'd like to mention. right? Which is "À meia-noite levarei sua alma," or "At midnight I'll take your soul." This film by José Mojica Marins. He's an independent filmmaker from São Paulo, whose most successful creation is arguably the character Coffin Joe, Zé do Caixão, this unholy undertaker who's obsessed with the supernatural and longing to sire the perfect son. So this film is an attempt at the horror genre, right? And issues such as progeny and bloodlines emerge here as pivotal Gothic themes. He wants a hair. So the Victorian garments worn by the character are completely extraneous to Brazil, right? But they contribute to Coffin Joe's visual characterization. They kind of aggrandize the grave digger, who would not be as influential without his attire. In the dynamics of cross-cultural exchange, these appropriation from Anglo-American Gothic means to capitalize on the success of foreign films and to promote the Brazilian character in relation to international horror icons, such as Jack the Ripper and Mr. Hyde, and all those Victorian characters, right? Top hat and a cape. So not very Brazilian at all. But rather than historical or cultural accuracy, the director creates a cinematic spectacle for his audience. That's what he means to do. But it's too low budget to be scary, right? All in all, it comes across as funny. But you see, throughout the film, Zé do Caixão, Coffin Joe, he rapes, he mutilates, he tortures, and he kills people. I'll highlight here one scene in which he whips the body and face of a black man until he collapses to his knees. You see, the choice of actor, he had many actors to choose from. He chose the black man for the whip, right? So the choice of actor and the instrument of torture for this scene touches the issue of slavery, addressing Brazil's historical past and exposing racial tensions in the nation. The representation of sexual racial aggression. He uses camera techniques that victimize the spectation. In one scene, he inverts the camera, so it's you, the spectator, who gets hit. The crimes that he commits for believing that everything is possible in a lawless place, they were kind of unique displays of violence for Brazilian audiences in the 1960s. Remember that this was the time when the Brazilian dictatorship came to power, 1964, the same year that the film was released. So looking beyond the film boundaries, there is a correlation between Zé do Caixão, Coffin Joe, and state-sanctioned forms of violence. You can correlate these two, right? So some conclusions, right? So I have argued here that although Brazil has this rich folkloric tradition and also received significant literary input from Gothic novels, the institutional discourse shaped by influential scholars didn't really value these narratives related to supernatural horror. And it's only recently that contemporaries are trying to fill in this gap, adopting the concept of Gothic that is not related to genre, but rather to discourse, right? Linguistic procedures. These recent studies, they are no longer centered around the idea of originality, but is seeking to understand what these Gothic supernatural features mean in a Brazilian context. So far, we have understood that Gothic narratives of imagination, mystery, and horror They manifest themselves in prose and in verse. And that there are polyvalent trends, including a more comical side. However, this is not a debasement of the Gothic, right? But rather a way of presenting social criticism, self-deprecating way. And also, it's often the case that this Gothic discourse, function in terms of nationality, representing the image of a savage, uncivilized country marked by colonization, slavery, dictatorship, that the official mainstream history has tried so hard to suppress, right? So it's often the case as well that Brazilian Gothic pops up in these narratives to remind us of our complexes, our traumas about being this agrarian and mestizo nation, which remains to be admitted, is still very immature in terms of our collective identity and is still colonized in many ways. So I have tried to illustrate this with examples from literature and film to show that our scenes of cruelty and bloodshed, and even humor sometimes, can often explain certain aspects of the political moment the country was experiencing. So thank you very much for listening. And here are my references. Thank you again.